Thanks everyone for joining us today for this next session of Price Talks, Policy in a Pandemic series. So I'm Lois Takahashi, and I'm director of the USC Price School in Sacramento, where we offer a Master in Public Administration degree program for full-time working professionals. And before I get started, I'd like to thank the team, Harley, Katie, who's online also, Jonathan and Anthony, and the rest of the USC Price team for organizing the series and keeping us going in this new pandemic, unprecedented time of online interaction. So Harley, could you please put up the poll? I'd like for us to take a short poll where we are answering one question. Have you ever been called a name or been harassed in any way because of who you are or how you look? So please answer the question, which looks like it's going well. I want to talk today about these increasing reports about attacks and harassment directed toward Asian Americans here in the United States. Some of these incidents have been small, being looked at aggressively, being coughed at, being spit on, but there have also been other larger, potentially violent hate crimes, including vandalism and physical assaults and stabbings. I'm sure many of you know about the stabbing that took place in Texas at a big box retail business where an individual slashed a toddler and a 6-year-old child because he thought that they were carriers of the novel coronavirus. So we've heard statements about these sorts of harassment, bias, discrimination, and attacks early on from U.S. congressional leadership, in the ethnic caucuses, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, the League of California Cities, Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, and a whole host of community-based and advocacy organizations. More recently, we've heard from other elected officials, including presidential candidate Joe Biden, who have released statements condemning harassment and violence. To track these incidents, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, APCON, based in Southern California, which represents a coalition of more than 40 organizations, reported recently that they received over 1,000 reports of harassment related to coronavirus by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. over a 2-week period. That's between about 80 to 100 incidents per day. The site was founded by APCON, the Chinese for Affirmative Action, which is an advocacy organization in Northern California, and the San Francisco State University Department of Asian American Studies, and we'll make that website or the tracker available to you after the session if you would like to report any incidents. Harassment and violence directed toward Asian Americans and linked to nation states outside the U.S. is, of course, nothing new. You may remember the case of Vincent Chin, who was bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat by 2 auto workers, one a Chrysler auto worker and a former auto worker, in Metro Detroit in 1982. Detroit's auto industry was at the time undergoing a massive steep declines, in part because of competition by the Japanese auto industry. After this beating, which, like I said, was used, a baseball bat was used to bludgeon Mr. Chin numerous times, the 2 men pled guilty. Actually, there was no prosecutor who showed up in the court trial, and no contest. The plea was no manslaughter or no contest to manslaughter, and they were both fined, the 2 men, $3,000 in court costs, and served 3 years probation, but no jail time. So an Academy Award nominated documentary, Who Killed Vincent Chin, by Christine Choi and Renee Tajima Pena, documents this incident and what happens. So why is this all happening? Because of the unknown, uncertainty, the anxiety around COVID-19, there have been lots of sort of questions asked, but also people have been behaving in ways that, based on their personal experience, based on what information they have, to try to respond to this highly infectious and seemingly highly dangerous disease that's been affecting many people. And unfortunately, many of the kind of everyday responses that you have, or we all have, center on stigmatized identities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So while I'm focusing on Asian Americans, there have also been incidents in other communities of color. I've seen a lot of posts on Facebook and other social media platforms by African Americans in particular, who are, of course, wearing face masks, as we all are in certain areas they're required, with these African American, particularly males, responding that because they're wearing masks, that they've been getting negative response by police or security guards, and they're worried about public response as well. And of course, there's been health disparities, disparities in deaths and mortality related to COVID-19 by race, ethnicity. So there are issues related to structural discrimination and stigma that we need to talk about. So along with these individual issues, though, of individual harassment, bias, and attacks, stigma is also important because it can result in federal, state, and local policies that exclude and incarcerate. So two examples that have been kind of reemerging in discussion among people as we think about how stigma affects policymaking are the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, federal law which restricted immigration by Chinese nationals, and closer to a lot of our experience, the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. So both of these federal policies resulted in Asian immigrants and Asian Americans being, at the best side, the best case scenario, denied opportunities, and in the worst case scenario, being incarcerated or killed. So how do we understand how this idea about stigma and bias relate to behavior and policy? Michael Omi from UC Berkeley and Howard Wynant from UC Santa Barbara wrote a very important book called Racial Formation in the United States. We'll make that link available to you as well. Published by Routledge. The third edition came out in 2014. And I think what's helpful here is that they categorize race into 4 different elements, which I think help us to understand why there are these connections between larger global issues and individual and federal, state, and local policies. So there are 4 elements. Race is defined by Omi and Wynant as biology, as ethnicity, as nation state, and as social construction. So let me just walk through these very quickly because I don't have very much time today. Race as biology is the sort of typical way we understand race. Race is physical characteristics, as genetic makeup, it's sort of the way people look, which is why I asked you whether or not you'd ever been called a name because of how you look, because that's typically the way we understand, the wider public understands what race is. So that's the first category. The second category is race as ethnicity, which is not quite the same as race as biology. The example that Omi and Wynant use in their book is that of Irish Americans. So Irish Americans carry race as biology, but they also carry race in this other way where we think about Irish Americans now as celebrating St. Patrick's Day, where we celebrate their Irish American contributions and cultural practices and food and other sorts of ways that we engage with Irish American ethnic identity. So race as ethnicity is a little bit different than race as biology. You may carry race as biology as having physical characteristics, but you may also carry race as ethnicity through cultural practices, food, celebrations, etc. The third element is race as nation state, and this is where the idea that the COVID-19 pandemic is labeled in a certain way becomes important. So the Trump administration has repeatedly described the COVID-19 disease and the novel coronavirus as Chinese flu, Wuhan flu. They've used this kind of nation state identification as the way they have categorized and characterized this pandemic. And, you know, the argument is that, well, it originated in China, so we should call it Chinese flu because that's what it is. But actually, if you think about what that does, Omi and Wynant would argue in the race as social construction element about race, that whenever you use race as biology, race as ethnicity, or race as nation state, you're engaging what they call racial projects. And what racial projects are when you use these other elements to further an objective or goal that you might have. So through this act of naming the COVID-19 pandemic as Chinese flu or Wuhan flu or a number of other ways that they frame this, this has ripple effects because remember, those of us who are walking through life, everyone, we're not sort of sitting there and constantly reevaluating our assumptions about race or ethnicity or disease. We're sort of making these quick judgments because we have to with all this information coming in. And so you can envision that framing COVID-19 as the race as nation state lens may have some effects on the people's perception of race as biology, race as ethnicity. And so you can see that there's a connection, though I'm not saying it's causal because we'd have to go study that, but there's a connection between naming something as Chinese flu and potentially people thinking that Chinese people or people who look Asian or people who look Asian and wearing masks or people who look Asian and sneeze or cough, so sneezing is not a symptom of COVID-19, may be associated with this Chinese flu. So there's this connecting the dots that doesn't happen for people who are calling it Chinese flu, but for the mainstream public, those elements about race that Omi and Wynett have nicely characterized for us all combine together into one mass, and so therefore Chinese flu can then inform us as thinking that Chinese-looking people or Asian-looking people may be carriers of this disease. So we're all looking for signs, and I think because we believe that there's this connection between Chinese flu and Asian American racist biology, now you can see that there's this link between what you might think and talk about in terms of the federal policy arena and what individuals might be doing out there to harass or commit violent acts against folks who look Asian. Now, why does stigma like this happen, and why is it so powerful? So let me take a look at this poll. I think the poll is still up. So 83% of you, online now, there's 110 people who voted. 83% of you said yes, you've ever been called a name or harassed in any way because of who you are or how you look. About 17% said no. So I will stop sharing that. So we have to think about, why is this stuff called stigma? Why is it so powerful, and how does this happen? And 83% of you have experienced this in some way. So Irving Goffman in the 1960s talked about how stigma works in making people and groups less valued in society. And part of this is that our natural inclination is to want to belong to something. And in wanting to belong to something, you have to define where the boundary of that something is. So when defining where the boundary of that something is, you define what it is not. And so stigma is about what you are not, to help you reinforce within your own group what you are. So when we look for the explanation for disease, pandemics of this kind, like COVID-19, many of the questions that keep coming up are, who was the first person infected? How did that person get infected? And where did the disease come from? A lot of interest in establishing where the disease came from in terms of geographic location. So there were genetic research done to show that the New York epidemic, the New York kind of explosion of COVID-19 cases was actually not from direct transmission from someone from China or someone who traveled to China. It was actually from Europe. So we're always looking for, how did this happen to breach the boundary of who we are? So if you think about stigma and COVID-19, what are the elements of stigma that relate to COVID-19? One of those things I think that is very important is that the disease itself is seen as very dirty. And disease in general is seen as dirty, but you can think about COVID-19 in particular as being defined by its virulence as a virus, but also its the need to sterilize everything to ensure that you're not infected. So the idea that COVID-19 is somehow dirty, it's polluted, it's something that's not pure, it requires that we disinfect everything. Now, disinfection, I'm not saying you shouldn't wash your hands and disinfect everything, because that's a public health kind of practice we should be all engaged in. But the more we kind of think about it, and the more we transfer that information, that sort of stigmatized label to people, like Chinese flu again, the more that those labels tend to stick. So let me talk a little bit about somebody else who talked about these issues. Herbert Gans, who's another famous sociologist, anthropologist, talked about stereotypes, which is very related to these issues, in the 1990s. And he was talking about stereotypes related to low-income people, poor people, if I can use that in quotes. And he developed this very good quote and definition, which I think is very helpful. So let me kind of quote and sort of paraphrase what he said. He says that stereotypes are really powerful because they extrapolate from small kernels of truth about some people. They expand them and distort them into what he called large imagined untruths about large groups of people. So again, you start with a small kernel of truth about a few people. You distort, expand, and scale that to be large imagined untruths about lots of people. And so you can imagine when you try to talk about what may be seeming to you to be an untruth about a large group of people, people often, and I've tried to, in my career, tried to sort of address the stigma stuff head on, people will always say to me, often say to me, that, well, actually, I know this about this one person. So that is the evidence that they're using to support this large imagined untruths. So I'm running out of time here, so let me talk about what we can do about this. So action about reducing harassment and discrimination. And number one thing I have on my mind is please support Asian American businesses. They were suffering steep declines even before the shelter-in-place directives, largely because of this bias and kind of discrimination against Asian Americans. When you see others experiencing harassment, try to be an ally. When you see incidences or experience incidences of discrimination, bias, and harassment, which many of you have said that in your lives you already have, now it's really important to report these incidents to law enforcement and to the website tracker, which we will provide later after the session is over. And in terms of policy, please support and advocate for anti-discrimination policies and laws. Getting at this sort of deeper stigma kind of system in your brain that allows you to make quick decisions, though, is a little bit more difficult. So there are a few things that I would suggest that you think about. First, be aware of the power of labels and try to use non-stigmatizing labels if you can. So the really good practice here is COVID-19 instead of China flu. There are reasons why China flu results in really horrible things that are happening to individuals. And so COVID-19 is a much better way to talk about this. Number two, this is hard too. Resist your common sense about peoples and places, because for many people, their common sense emanates from these social norms, which emanate from these stigmatized labels that aim to put blame on other people, but also aim to kind of reinforce the group belonging identity issue. So try to think through before you make snap judgments that you think are based on kernels of truth. They may actually be based on these large imagined untruths. And finally, especially with respect to COVID-19, please rely on science and reliable evidence to make decisions about actions. There's a lot of science going on right now. We have Neeraj Sood is working on at USC Price, working on random testing to see how immunity is expanding or not, and how many people are affected in Los Angeles County. We talked to Richard Green, just talked, I think, a couple days ago about the anxiety and fear around the economy. Minnie Romero talked about how this is going to relate to democratic practices. Really relying on science and reliable information is going to help us get through this pandemic. So I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and I will open it up now for questions.
Is racial stigma towards Asians endemic to American society? How does it differ from the way other people of color are treated?
So I would say that the interesting thing about this pandemic is that we're seeing similar kinds of behavior globally. So this is not just about Asian Americans in the US. This is about how people are reacting to individuals when they see them on the ground wherever you're at. Now, when we're talking about racial discrimination or racial prejudice, bias, harassment, different groups have experienced discrimination and racial bias in different ways. In particular with Asian Americans, what we found is there are historical trends that relate to issues about economic instability. There are global issues where nation states are in competition with US-based sectors, economic sectors. But then, when there's war or when 9/11 was a really good example about South Asians and Muslims. So different things trigger different acts at the local level. What we can't do is to get into this idea that every single act we see is the act of an individual racist person. That's where you start to lose the connection to broader issues related to things like stigma, things like how federal policy relates to stigma, et cetera. So we have to keep our eye on the ball. Yes, be an ally at the local level with individuals, but remember that these are structural forces.
Okay. The next question is, why is the President of the United States so biased and denying the truth? Does he set the tone for certain segments of the US population to mirror his behavior and unjust treatment of Asians?
So what I would say is that there are a lot of reasons. We go back to Omi and Juanit, my kind of discussion of that. People in power use, and people not in power, use this idea about race as biology, race as ethnicity, race as nation state to further specific kinds of objectives and goals. So there was some debate actually on social media about Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, talking about how to address the discrimination and harassment directed at Asian Americans by becoming what he called better Americans, be more patriotic. And there was a lot of debate among Asian groups, I think, around what does it mean to be a better American? We're already great Americans. I mean, what else do we have to do? And a reflection back to World War II when Japanese Americans were asked to do the same thing. They did all of that and they were still incarcerated. So, I mean, I think you have to go back and look at history. You have to think about the structural forces involved. You have to kind of understand how to make people more aware, but also engage in practices that are going to move us towards anti-discrimination policies. So I think it's a little bit more broad than one person. It's a whole structure and system that we have to be aware of, address, and act upon.
Okay, the next question is, can you talk more about the notion of racial projects and how we may build policy interventions to prevent these social constructions from creating inequitably responses to COVID-19? I'm wondering if there's already dialogue about this.
So from Omi and Juanit's point of view, there could be good racial projects or non-progressive racial projects. It's about using the idea of race as biology, race as ethnicity, race as nation state to further some kind of objective. So if you're doing progressive work, that's still a racial project because you're using the notions of race to further an objective. So the goal here today is to make sure that we all understand that we're engaged in work around race. Those are racial projects too, but that you have different objectives and goals. Now, how to be more progressive in this sort of era of confusion and anxiety and fear, I think we have to operate on multiple dimensions and multiple scales and think about relating back to history, which I think a lot of advocates are doing now, kind of retelling the stories of, say, Vincent Chin, Angel Island on the West Coast, Chinese exclusion, and try to remember that these things have happened before. So how do we learn from those historical examples and move forward in a way that's productive?
There's a lot of questions coming through, so we're going to try to get through as many of them as we can. So apologies if we don't get to your question. The next question is stigmatization an immutable fact of human makeup that will always rear its head and require constant vigilance and response to reduce?
You know, stigma is an interesting thing because you don't think about it a lot. So part of the issue and the challenge with addressing stigma is that a lot of the stigma that's happening within you as an individual, you didn't sort of say, oh, I'm going to wake up this morning and I'm going to stigmatize a bunch of people. It's all part and parcel of this idea that we all want to belong somewhere and that we feel that in belonging somewhere, the best way to identify where we belong is to also say, well, those people don't belong. So, I mean, I think it's a struggle to address because it's kind of a shortcut way to understand how to react to folks. So is it inevitable? No. Is it challenging? Yes. Is it going to be difficult to overcome? Absolutely.
The next question is, certain political leaders thrive and survive on creating, perpetuating division. Any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts on all of that stuff, but I mean, that's a very good question. It's a broader debate. I mean, I think a lot of these talks in the series are addressing some of these issues of division, fear, anxiety. So I would encourage you to continue to watch these different talks so that you get different perspectives on what's the actual nugget of the issue is. But you know, division is easy because it relates to fear. And so, you know, part of the way to overcome division is to think through, from your own personal point of view, what is it that I'm doing to stigmatize somebody else so I don't even have a conversation with that person? So if you're thinking that division is an inevitable part of political dialogue, it is not. But it's very difficult to overcome those divisions to get to some place where you're actually having a dialogue instead of an outright battle and fight. So if you're not going to get to somewhere, you just think it's, you know, this is not worth my time. Conversation is worth your time, but it's a matter of you kind of thinking through, what am I doing to create the boundary that says that I am part of this group and that that group is not only different from me, but the enemy of me? These are all really good questions, by the way. They're hard, but I think they're worth thinking about.
Yes. Next question is, given the beliefs some people have that if I don't see it, it must not be true, what tactics do you have about making people recognize, acknowledge, accept that things like racism are a very real thing with very real consequences for others?
So with respect to COVID-19, what's interesting is that what's happening in New York and other places where there have been a lot of deaths, Chicago, Detroit, is that we're starting to see that these deaths are actually different by racial groups. So where I always start is look at the science, look at the data, and if people are not collecting the data, go collect it. So there have been a lot of advocate sort of cries for collecting more data by demographic groups so that we can understand the differential impacts of COVID-19. And for COVID-19, what's happening is in a lot of places is that African Americans are dying at much higher rates than everybody else. So the question is, why is that happening? So from a research point of view, it's always important to start with, we need to collect more information so that we have evidence from which we can devise projections and recommendations, then we act. Otherwise, you're sort of just claiming things and there's a bunch of opinions rushing around, which may not be wrong, but for a researcher, we need some evidence. Otherwise, it's kind of, you don't really want to move forward.
What can philanthropic organizations do to support anti-hate and anti-discrimination efforts?
So I think in an interesting way, the community-based and philanthropic organizations are doing a lot already. They were out in front of this. So the tracker that I was talking about is something that's being done by APCON, CAA, and San Francisco State University. So I think that there's a lot going on already. Tracking information is really important. It's insufficient to just talk about anecdotal evidence. One or two people found this thing. I mean, it's useful, but we need more kind of data to be able to understand what the problems are about. I mean, I think philanthropic organizations are also stepping in, at least in California, to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society have more resources. So, this is a very difficult time for a lot of people, but the most vulnerable in our society. There was a report that was just released by the Economic Roundtable about which jobs are going to be most vulnerable over the next phase as we try to make it through COVID-19. So I think the philanthropic community is doing a great job. I think we just need to keep stepping it up so that we are filling the gap that other agencies are not able to fill for whatever reason.
Okay, and the last question we'll get to today is it possible to confront the Chinese government's response to the initial COVID-19 outbreak without reinforcing negative stigmas? If so, how?
So that's a really big question. I mean, I think it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, international relations aside. I mean, I think the one thing to do is to remember that when you establish linkages between dangerous things, nation states, and racial groups, what will probably happen here in the U.S. is that individual ethnic groups will bear the brunt of discriminatory, harassing, and biased practices. So we have to be careful about ensuring that in the U.S. our communities are protected, but also that people are made aware that they're doing things because of innate understandings about how populations are without basing them really on facts. So we've got to go back to truth rather than basing them on untruths, and then we also have to think through always how to relate what we think to and how we collect data to policies that should be enacted at any scale. Local, state, federal, and international.
Great. Thank you. For the questions we did not get to today, I am keeping the questions, and if you want to email them to me, I'm happy to pass them on to Lois, and we will get them answered for you, and we can post them as well. But thank you so much for joining us today for our Price Talks. We have 3 coming up next week on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we hope that you enjoyed this session. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody, and stay safe.